Good morning and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This morning, we are going to continue conversations about S5, the Affordable Heat Act. And we have with us Laura Murphy, the Assistant Attorney General. Welcome, Ms. Murphy.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for having me. For the record, I'm Laura Murphy. I'm the Director of the Environmental Protection Unit at the Attorney General's Office and an Assistant Attorney General there. And again, thank you for having me this morning. So I thought what I would do is talk through some of the prior testimony that I've given on this bill and as it specifically relates to a constitutional issue, the Dormant Commerce Clause, if that sounds okay and if that would be helpful. And I should also start by saying that, as you probably know, Attorney General Clark is incredibly supportive of Global Warming Solutions Act and also the Clean Heat Standard and reducing Vermont's greenhouse gases. So thank you for your work on this.
Celia.
Yes. Good morning. It would be helpful if you would also just refresh for the committee or help the committee understand the obligations that we have under the Global Warming Solutions Act as well.
Yes. So the obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act, and they're tiered, but essentially by 2050, Vermont needs to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that it produces by a certain amount. And I don't have that number right in front of me, but it may be in the findings of S5.
We got that in testimony yesterday, so that's okay.
So I apologize, but yeah, there's certain levels of reductions that need to be achieved on a timeline with the end goal of 2050. I believe it's 80%. And those are mandatory reductions, of course, as you probably know.
Yes.
And is that kind of what you're thinking, like a mandatory reduction from where we sit? Is that?
So previously, before the Global Warming Solutions Act, there were goals for Vermont to achieve greenhouse gas reductions. And with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, the legislature essentially said, Vermont, these aren't goals anymore. These are things that you must do under this law. And in that sense, it's mandatory.
And if we don't do them, what happens?
Well,
that is actually the piece, Madam Chair, that I think is important for the committee to understand what the remedy is if there is a lawsuit.
So if it depends. And essentially, I think first of all, what happens is we don't achieve the reductions and we don't have the associated benefit, very important benefit of mitigating climate change here in Vermont, which of course is what the Global Warming Solutions Act is concerned with. In terms of accountability, which I think might be something that the committee is interested in, it really depends on how things play out. There are a few mechanisms by which interested parties can sue the state if we don't meet the reductions, but it really depends on the circumstances. And so, for instance, so one of the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act is for ANR to adopt, the Agency of Natural Resources to adopt regulations by certain dates consistent with the Climate Action Plan, which is developed by the Climate Council. If ANR doesn't adopt the regulations that are essentially called for by the climate plan on a certain deadline, there's a cause of action or a lawsuit available to essentially sue ANR and say, hey, you didn't meet your deadline to adopt these regulations. There's a second cause of action in the Global Warming Solutions Act that says, okay, let's say ANR adopts the regulations consistent with the climate plan, and down the road after a greenhouse gas inventory comes out, and those come out on a periodic basis, essentially catalog our reductions. If ANR's regulations and if that's showing we're not in fact meeting the reductions under the Global Warming Solutions Act, and ANR's regulations are a substantial cause of the failure to meet those reductions, and that's kind of a separate issue, then there are remedies that the court can order, including essentially telling ANR to go back and write stronger regulations. So those are basically the two mechanisms. And the other accountability is I would say, political accountability.
Thank you.
Sure. So with that, I'll move on to S5 and the Affordable Heat Act, which establishes, as you know, a clean heat standard. And I understand you've already had some testimony about this. So one of the things when a law is passed, one of the things to consider, of course, is whether it's constitutional. And when something touches on commerce or articles of commerce and interstate commerce, sometimes a question that comes up is whether it survives the dormant commerce clause. And what that is essentially the flip side of the commerce clause in the US Constitution. So the United States Constitution says Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. Flip side of that is that states essentially can't unduly burden or discriminate against interstate or out-of-state commerce. So there's a series of tests. You may have heard of constitutional tests before. There's a series of tests you walk through to see whether a state law is in fact permissible under the Dormant Commerce Clause. And so I thought what I would do is walk through some of those today and explain our thoughts on how they relate to this bill S5. And I should also mention, if you're not already aware, Jeff Hand and what was formerly known as Dunkiel-Saunders, I believe it's now called SRH law, they did a memo for the Clean Heat Standard Working Group in January of last year that really walks through in more detail the various legal issues related to the bill. So if you were interested in more detail, I would certainly recommend Jeff to provide additional.
You have a question? That's great.
All right, so I'll start with the caveat, lawyer caveat. There are no guarantees when you go to court. That's always the case, but our assessment of this bill is that it is constitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause, and I'll kind of walk through why we believe that to be the case. So the first test when you're looking at the Dormant Commerce Clause is whether there is facial discrimination. And this is essentially what it sounds like. On the face of the bill, does the language discriminate between in-state and out-of-state products? So an example is, and this is from 2005, there was a Michigan law that banned out-of-state wineries from shipping directly to homes, but it didn't ban in-state wineries from shipping directly to homes. That was on the face of the law. So that was not okay. This bill, S5, does not do that. It applies equally to heating fuel, whether from in-state or out-of-state. And similarly, and this again is on its face, the opportunities to provide the clean heat measures in Vermont, the opportunities to sell products to satisfy those clean heat measures are open to companies, whether in-state or out-of-state. So it's not a law that says only Vermont companies can, provide these measures. The next test is what I will call the discriminatory purpose or effect. So this is where the face of the law doesn't say in-state or out-of-state, but in fact, there's a discriminatory purpose or effect. An example of this is kind of interesting from North Carolina. This was back in the 70s, where I guess North Carolina was competing with Washington State in terms of apple production and apple sales. So North Carolina passed a law that said all apples sold in the state can only have a certain kind of label. And on its face, it applied to in-state apples and out-of-state apples. But the purpose and effect of it was, in fact, to ensure that the Washington State apples couldn't be labeled as Washington apples, because that was something that people would want, which would increase the chances of people buying North Carolina apples. So, and there was in that case, I believe, some testimony in the record about the purpose of the North Carolina lawmakers to promote North Carolina apples at the expense of Washington apples. So that wasn't okay. So again, S5 doesn't do that. It applies equally to heating fuels, whether in-state or out-of-state. And I will emphasize again, the opportunities to provide the clean heat measures similarly apply to in-state and out-of-state companies. And in truth, and I don't know this, but it could be that most of the manufacturers for the clean heat measure products could be out of state. So that should not be a concern here. And there's kind of a related issue that has come up in Vermont before related to the discriminatory purpose or effect, which is out-of-state companies who sell their products in Vermont having compliance costs, and simply having a compliance cost to comply with Vermont's law doesn't rise to the level of discriminatory purpose or effect. An example is when Vermont passed a labeling law for mercury in light bulbs. That was challenged, and the court said, no, Vermont can do that. Upstream compliance costs doesn't make this law invalid. And similarly, when we passed our law on labeling of genetically engineered foods, although that was ultimately preempted before that happened, the court said that is also the fact that these out-of-state food companies have compliance costs doesn't invalidate the law. So the third test is, yes.
Question, when would a compliance cost invalidate it?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if there is a point at which compliance costs would be too heavy to actually invalidate a law, in part because sales into the state are voluntary. So I'm not sure about that.
Thanks.
Third test is the extraterritorial test, and this essentially asks whether the state is requiring out-of-state commerce that is wholly outside the state to be conducted in a certain way. An example of this, which is a little bit complicated, Connecticut passed a law that required breweries to essentially make an affirmation in Connecticut that they would not charge lower prices for their products in any other state than Connecticut. Problem was the Connecticut affirmation lasted for a month. So during that month, companies out of state were essentially precluded from raising their prices in other states because they had made this affirmation in Connecticut. Again, extraterritoriality should not be an issue with S5. It's very clearly regulates in-state products, heating fuel that is used in the state. Additionally, which is sort of icing on the cake, the obligated parties are the parties who bring the heating fuel into the state. So there's a really strong connection with what's happening here in the state. Or if it's not the party bringing the fuel into the state, it's the party who produces or refines or compounds it here in the state. Again, it's very focused on Vermont. So we don't think extraterritoriality should be an issue. And the fourth test is called the Pike balancing test. This is once a court gets to this, typically a court will go through all of these tests and then get to the Pike balancing test. And laws are usually upheld under this test. And the question is whether, to the extent there are any burdens on interstate commerce, whether they are clearly excessive in relation to the local benefits. And again, that should not be the case here. This bill is very firmly grounded in strong traditional state interests, protecting health, safety, and welfare, protecting the environment. Whereas any burden on interstate commerce is not excessive, much less clearly excessive. Again, sales are voluntary. There are different types of methods that companies can choose to comply with the clean heat measures. They can go through the default delivery agent. They can provide that themselves. And again, out-of-state companies have the same opportunities to sell these products in Vermont. So those are the four tests for the Dormant Commerce Clause. Again, there's no guarantees. We do believe the bill is constitutional. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy to talk further.
Dennis Smith.
Thank you. You started off your testimony stating that the Attorney General fully supports this bill. Am I correct?
Correct.
Why doesn't the state's Attorney General remain neutral in something like this rather than show support for a bill that a good percentage of Vermonters don't agree with?
Before I would answer that, I would have to go back and I believe that's a question that I can't properly answer without having the Attorney General provide her answer.
Is it the Attorney General's position to remain neutral until something is presented in front of the Attorney General in a court?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
You are an attorney, correct?
I am an attorney, yes, but I
don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'm afraid I can't speak for the Attorney General right now without having vetted these particular questions with her.
All right, thank you.
Representative Clifton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in the beginning, you stated, thank you for testifying. The goals, the mandatory goals for the Global Warming Solutions Act. If we don't meet those goals, okay, we can't mitigate climate change, right? Is that what you said?
Well, I suppose there could still be some mitigation of climate change here in Vermont. And by mitigation, I mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
So maybe we'll reduce some, but if we don't meet the goals, we won't have achieved what's contemplated in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Okay, so well, I guess what I'm getting at is, say there's flooding and it's determined that it's the whole climate change issue. Would we, if we didn't meet those rules and we, could we lose funding from FEMA from any kind of flooding issues or anything?
Not that I am aware of.
Okay.
Again, that's, I have to say, I don't know the answer, but I don't believe there's any such requirement.
Okay. All right.
With
Just
a caveat.
curious, if, you know, if we don't, like if the, you know, the federal government says, so you didn't meet this, so we're not going to give you funding for this. That's where I was going.
I don't believe that to be the case. Again, I haven't looked at that specific question,
Okay.
but I don't believe that to be the
Okay.
case.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members? Representative Morris.
Madam Chair. Thank you for coming in this morning. Talk just briefly, we kind of skimmed over lawsuits. We don't obtain our goal. I'm struggling with how that would even be, what impact it would have on our court system or how it would even get to a court system. And second part of that is if a person that doesn't initiate or believe in the Global Warming Solutions Act, or doesn't participate in alternative heating, are they going to be allowed to sue as well?
So the question about who can sue is related to it is a doctrine called standing to sue. And so the question, I hate to opine too much on hypotheticals, but the question would be in any inquiry where someone wants to bring a lawsuit, there's a constitutional threshold that has to be met. And the test is there an injury in fact to this person that is imminent and not hypothetical? And that can be, the injury test can be met in a variety of different ways. There's all different sorts of case law about that. Was the injury caused by the action that's being complained about, essentially? Is there causation? And third, can the court redress the injury through a decision and some sort of remedy? So those are the steps that would need to be walked through for someone. And this is always when someone brings a lawsuit. That's the threshold that needs to be met. Really depends on the circumstances. So whether or not someone had participated in rulemaking might be relevant. It might not be, depending on the circumstances. It depends, as lawyers like to say.
Spoken very well.
Representative Pat.
I'm just curious when you were talking about the interstate commerce issues, whether you had also looked at the regional greenhouse gas initiative that electric utilities in New England are bound by, including Vermont. In that case, it's not the entities that import into Vermont, but the entities that import into the states that are part of the ISO New England, which is the New England states. And I wondered whether that issue had ever come up, because what it does, who generates funds, some of which then come to Vermont for things like energy efficiency, are companies that are generating and importing power into that group of states.
I have not specifically looked at that issue. I do believe that others have.
Mhm.
I would say that there, as long as something is being used in Vermont or intended for use in Vermont. So there's some portion of what's being imported into the region is going to be used in Vermont. So that's a hook. And that's really important in terms of the extraterritorial analysis.
Thank you for your testimony. It was really helpful. Good framing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Chair, actually,
Representative Sibilia.
yes, one more question. So if there were a suit filed alleging that this at the S5 violated the dormant commerce clause, the Attorney General's office would.
The Attorney General's office defends the constitutionality of statutes when they're challenged. Yeah.
That's it.
And Representative Smith asked a couple of questions. I'm wondering if you could circle back and share those answers with us.
Sure. And if it would be possible to have them framed up, that would be great.
That's absolutely, I think you would do that, right, Representative Smith? Okay, thanks. Right. Thank you again for your time.
Great. Thank you very much.
Right. Next, we have Richard Cowart from the Vermont Climate Council. And actually, I'm just going to take a second for a public service announcement. Folks in the room, we have a room number limit that I just need to put out there as we move forward on testimony here that it's 16. So we're okay today because we're down some folks, but there's a little appreciation of self-monitoring if possible, but witnesses, of course, have priority, and then first folks in have second priority. We basically have 4 extra spots available for being in the room for public health reasons. Appreciate your understanding of that. Welcome.
All right, good
Howard.
morning. Happy to be here. And sorry, I'm just trying to coordinate the overheads with the text with doing this a bit differently. For the record, my name is Richard Cowart. I'm a member of the Vermont Climate Council. I am co-chair of what's called the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Climate Council. So working on these climate emission mitigation strategies that were included in the climate plan. For those of you who don't know me, I got my start in state government in Vermont as executive officer of the Environmental Board under the first Snelling administration, and later served for 12 years as chair of the PUC, what is now the PUC. Since leaving the PUC, I've been working with a nonprofit called the Regulatory Assistance Project. That's a global, as I say, nonprofit that focuses on advising governments across the US and around the world principally on utility issues and climate and energy issues. So I have some decades of experience doing that. The Global Warming Solutions Act specifies the legislative appointees to represent different types of expertise and backgrounds. And specifically, I was asked by the speaker to join the Climate Council as a representative who works with an organization that does what my organization, RAP, does. I should make it clear that today I'm speaking as a member of the Climate Council, and really for myself. The Climate Council doesn't, vet anybody's testimony. So I'm giving you my opinions based on my experience, based on what the Climate Council has done, and happy to answer questions about that. You have the opportunity with the S5, the bill in front of you, to take an important step that would reduce Vermont's second largest source of climate pollution and would reduce the heating bills that Vermonters face over the long term due to the high and volatile cost of fossil fuels that we've been paying for years and years and years. And nobody needs reminding how volatile those prices can be and how high those prices can be. And getting off of the fossil fuel roller coaster turns out to be good economically, as well as important and essential to reduce climate emissions. That's basically, my message in a nutshell. We're going to see whether if I advance these slides, they work.
Work, Joe. Yeah.
All right. As you may have heard already, fossil heat is a really tough challenge. Like I said, I've been working on this topic, for a couple of decades around the world, and pretty much everywhere I go. Fossil heat in buildings, what the energy consumption in buildings, is one of the thorniest problems that we face. In meeting the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, the legislature required the Climate Council to come up with a plan that would reduce emissions in the thermal/building sector proportionately to its obligations generally. So, and to answer a question, asked a minute ago, that's a 40% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030 and an 80% reduction from 1990 by 2050. And there's some ways to interpret the 2050 language a little differently, but basically you got to think 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. That's the benchmark that the legislature has created. And the Climate Council attempted in its plan to come up with strategies that could do that. I think you heard yesterday extensive data presentation. So on the data, I'm going to go a little light on the data side of my presentation. But to let you know, and I'd like to emphasize something, that the strategies that we developed on the Climate Council to address the building sector were concerned with addressing the emission reduction required, with ensuring that we do so in an equitable way, in making sure that the proposals that we would recommend to the legislature would be effective, realistic, achievable. And I believe that's what has occurred with the development of S5. It's important to understand that the legislation is your legislation. The Climate Council recommended it, but the Climate Council didn't write it. It's written by legislators. And as you know, in large measure, it was the subject of testimony and discussed in both houses last year in somewhat different form than what we have today. I am not finding this slide going forward. Let's see if I can do this one. There we go. All right, you've seen this slide. A version of this slide yesterday, but it bears repeating that the high and volatile prices shown here for heating fuels in Vermont per million BTU delivered are largely the fossil fuels. And lower cost options are available to us if we make the transition to, at the bottom of this chart, you'll see heat pumps, advanced wood heat solutions, for example, wood pellets at the bottom of the chart, whereas propane, fuel oil, kerosene are at the top of the chart.
Representative Sibilia.
But I just want to take a minute and ask you a question. So I've, on that last slide, I have gotten some pretty panicked emails from folks who are worried that we're going to require them to take out their fossil fuel systems and replace it with electricity or heat pumps. So when we look at a slide like this and we see the volatility in the fossil fuels and the stability, the electric, when we think about what the clean heat standard, if enacted, would do, it's my sense, and I want to ask you, check with you about this. It's my sense that we're looking to reduce fossil fuel usage primarily, and also encourage implementation of new heat sources that are less fossil fuel dependent. So things like weatherization and such. Would you say that's the?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get to this in a minute,
Okay.
but it's important to emphasize that when we looked at the options available to us, one of the important criteria that we had in mind is that, I'm a Vermonter. I have like 4 different ways to heat my house, like a lot of people. And I would like to make those choices myself. So this is not a mandate on individual consumers to do anything. It is a mandate on the importers of fossil fuel to offer options to consumers that result in lower emissions. And as we see with Efficiency Vermont programs, for example, today, people aren't required to do it. They choose to do it because it makes sense for them to do it. And it fits in their timing. It fits when they want to make a change in their appliances, whatever. So
Sorry.
I would like to emphasize that point in response to your question. As you probably saw yesterday, the heating sources in Vermont are primarily fossil, much more so than the US average. And we have, compared to other states, a larger proportion of what's called delivered fuels than other states do. Most other states have a lot more gas pipeline penetration than we do. We're roughly, 75% delivered fuels and 25% pipeline. And Massachusetts is just the reverse. And some other states, very low fractions of delivered fuels. So we needed to design a policy that would work with what we have in Vermont. I mean, I have an oil tank in my basement, and many of you probably do too. And it needs to work with where people really are, where our buildings are. So,
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. You said that it is not going to be mandatory that this happens to fossil fuel burners.
correct. It's not mandatory on homeowners and business owners.
Example, someone decides, well, I'm going to keep burning fossil fuel. I'm going to burn oil in my oil furnace. Will they be paying, if they choose not to do anything different with their heating system, will they be paying more for heating fuel?
It depends. And I'm going to get into how the market might work. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
The basic concept of a clean heat standard is that it is used to the phrase performance standard, requiring the importers of fossil fuel. Now here it says heat providers, but it's the importers of fossil fuel into Vermont to deliver a gradually increasing percentage of low emission heating services to customers. So it's akin to the renewable portfolio standard that you may be familiar with on the electric system. We require over time the electric utilities to have an increasing percentage of renewable electricity. And this is it's a similar also to what we do with energy efficiency. There's an increasing percentage of energy efficiency services required under our law over time. This would apply the same kind of principle to the fossil heat business, which has so far not been subject to requirements like this. We've done a good job on electricity. We've done a good job on energy efficiency. So far, the fossil side has, except for the Vermont gas systems, the fossil side has not borne any performance obligation of this type. It's important to understand that there are a variety of ways to meet the clean heat obligation. This is another aspect of, to answer the question about customer choice. We believe that a performance standard will work better if it gives providers and the customers choices about how they want to proceed. Some people might really prefer to run a pellet stove. Some people might prefer to put some biofuel blend in their oil tank and change nothing in the way they heat their home. Some people might prefer to engage in a big renovation project and put in a lot of insulation in order to lower their bills. And they might prefer those things at different times in, the life history of their family or their building. And we wanted to write a bill that would allow a variety of choices. So weatherization, electric heat pumps, low emission fuels, geothermal heat pumps, controlled electric hot water heaters, heat pump hot water heaters, insulate your attic. There's lots of things that you can do to, lots of things that customers can do that would generate clean heat credits. Now, with respect to performance standards, it's important, for us to take note of the fact that we have a lot of experience around the country and around the world with performance standards. At least 30 states have renewable portfolio standards on electric companies. 25 states have efficiency performance standards. With respect to liquid fuels, there are low carbon fuel standards for transportation in California, Washington, and Oregon. The Massachusetts climate plan calls for a clean heat standard. The Vermont climate plan recommended to the legislature to adopt a clean heat standard. The state of Colorado has adopted a clean heat standard for its pipeline gas utilities. I mean, there's a lot of experience out there to learn from about how performance standards work. And I think that in the climate mitigation world, there is a lot of talk, it has been a lot of talk for years and years and years about carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. And I want to be clear here that the performance standard we're talking about here is neither a carbon tax nor a cap and trade regime. Just like a renewable portfolio standard for electricity is not in and of itself a carbon cap and trade. Although in this region, because we have the regional greenhouse gas initiative, you can have a cap and trade regime and a renewable portfolio standard working together. They do work together. But we don't have a cap on fossil fuels. We don't have a carbon tax on fossil fuels. And we, Climate Council considered it and decided that a performance standard would be more flexible, more attractive to consumers. And that's the recommendation that the council made. So we I could go into more depth as to why we concluded that a carbon tax is not the way to go. But maybe just thinking about the experience of the past year. Heat is an essential service. People are going to heat their homes. The price goes up like it did last year, like it is right now. Price goes up, people still heat their homes. So just raising the price is a relatively weak way to reduce emissions. And it's also unfair if you're not actually helping people to make changes that would reduce emissions and lower their bills. So a performance standard is intended to not to go in that direction, but instead to go in the direction of helping people to make changes that would lower their bills. The Vermont legislature studied this matter in 2019, and you all came to the conclusion that the carbon tax was not the way to go. And of course, the Climate Council took that into consideration.
Question.
Yes.
If Representative Sebelius has a question.
With regard to a price cap, you talk about, can you talk a bit about a price cap? So I've heard some folks discuss that might be a better thing to do, to set a price cap in our market that we're doing. What would be the effect of setting a price cap?
I guess I apologize.
For the credits.
Price cap for the credits.
Let's come back to this.
Yes.
Let's come back.
Yeah, we can talk about that as a potential guardrail or mitigation, safety belt, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's an excellent question. Happy to talk about it. So my job is to kind of introduce you to how a clean heat standard would work, and I refer to that as the architecture of a clean heat standard. And just so you get the basics, I'm going to take you through what is the obligation, who is obligated, how fast, how far, how to promote equity, what earns credits, do we have special consideration on things we want to affirmatively include or kind of exclude from the program, and then how is it administered? So it's first important, to keep in mind the balance of goals that and I think the legislature would like to meet. And if you read the Global Warming Solutions Act, it actually requires that we do all these things. These four, just put a simple square in the middle here and make it different than the three-legged stool. Because there are these four basic objectives. First, the Global Warming Solutions Act says we need a 40% reduction and an 80% reduction. Is it equitable? Are we protecting the most vulnerable Vermonters, the folks with the highest energy burdens, and the folks who need to get off of high-priced volatile fossil fuels more quickly than many others? Is it achievable? Is it realistic given our building stock? We have one of the oldest building stocks in the nation. We have a high proportion of propane and fuel oil heated homes. We have Vermonters want to choose how they heat their homes. And we have workforce constraints to think about as well if we want to make this really important transition. And then how do we lower bills and make this affordable across the board? All of those things are built into the design of the clean heat standard. Now, what is the nature of the obligation? There is not, this obligation is a positive obligation. People sometimes get this sort of backwards. Instead of putting a restriction from the top on the amount of fossil fuel that can be sold or the amount of emissions that can be emitted. And some states do that. You know, they have the European Union just adopted a cap and trade regime for the building sector and the transportation sector, for example. California and New York, California has and New York is considering an economy-wide cap and trade that would cap also the building sector. The Clean Heat Standard in Vermont doesn't do that. The Clean Heat Standard in Vermont basically starts with the customer and asks the question, what do we want to see happen in buildings? And what we want to see happening in buildings is that they transition to less emitting and over time more affordable heating sources. And so we're counting the addition of good things like we do with renewables. We count the addition of appropriate renewables to the Vermont electric grid, as opposed to putting a cap on how much electricity the utilities can sell. So it's an obligation to deliver clean heat measures that grows over time. It's who are the obligated parties? We began this process with the understanding that Vermont fuel dealers themselves are important parts of our community. They have important customer relationships. And we wanted, but on the other hand, they're selling a product that is polluting, climate polluting, and over time has to be reduced. So a goal of the Clean Heat Standard is to create a pathway for fuel dealers to sell different products, to sell heat pumps, to sell pellet stoves and pellets or biofuels, or other ways to help their customers transition from fossil to non-fossil heat. And for this reason, in order to make the fuel dealers world a world of transition and recognizing that some of them are small businesses, the obligation is not put on them. The obligation is put on the bigger wholesale level importers of fossil fuel into the state. It is those importers who have the obligation to demonstrate that clean heat measures have been delivered in the state. So, and by the way, credits are only earned by actions at Vermont customer locations. You don't get credits under this Clean Heat Standard for, as we used to say, planting trees in China. There are big cap and trade regimes that give credits for offsets that might happen somewhere else. This does not do that. This credits actions in Vermont buildings.
We have to have two questions. Representative Smith first.
Thank you. Can you tell me how much a credit is worth?
The market in credits will determine that.
Also, no one knows what these credits are worth when we talk about giving fuel dealers credits. They don't know what they're going to be getting, do they?
They will, I'll state it a little differently. Credits are earned for clean heat measures that are delivered to Vermont customers. And they're measured according to how much greenhouse gas emissions they reduce, right? So your credits are earned for actions that reduce emissions. The credits, the obligated parties are obliged to acquire those credits. There will be a market in credits. And I can't tell you what the market price of a credit is going to be.
Shouldn't we know that before we proceed?
No. In fact, one of the design features of a of a credit-based system is that we want to unleash market forces. We want entrepreneurs who can deliver heat pumps more cheaply than the next guy. We want that person to have an incentive to deliver them more cheaply. Therefore, the cost of credits will go down. So, and if customers decide to choose pellet stoves instead of heat pumps, then the question will be, what is the rebate that's required in the market to incentivize a customer to make that choice? So, in fact, this is a positive feature of bringing market competition to the delivery of clean heat measures.
So if someone decided they wanted to put a heat pump in to establish, they will receive credits for that? Am I correct?
Yes.
But the person putting in the heat pump isn't going to know how much the credit is going to be worth until after he pays for his heat pump. Am I correct?
No, because the market price will be known to anybody who's operating in that market at that point in time. And the legislation has mechanisms in it to ensure that there's some stability in the credit price. So the actors who are taking actions to earn credits will know at the time they're doing it what the credits are going to be worth. They won't know 5 years in advance necessarily.
Will the public know before S5 is either passed or, say, for example, S5 passes? Will they know, the people involved with these credits know what a credit is worth before this bill passes?
No, and I like I said, it will be a market-based system, and the price of credits, to the extent that they're sold, will be set in the market over time. And I think it's worth noting, we don't know what the price of fuel oil is going to be 5 years from now either. And the fuel dealers aren't going to tell us what the price of fuel oil is 5 years from now. And if you ask them to guarantee their prices 5 or 10 years from now, they would say, you're crazy. I can't possibly do that. But they're asking today in their bill inserts that the proponents of S5 be able to predict 5 and 10 years in advance how much a heat pump is going to cost and how much a credit for heat pumps is going to be worth. I don't think that that's a legitimate request. It's nice. I think I'm going to give you some reasons in a few minutes why I am pretty confident that this is an affordable and achievable goal. But people need to understand that when you create a market, that's the whole point is not to create a fixed market price. Shall I go on?
Well, yeah, I appreciate all the questions. I want to be aware of time, and Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. If you go back a slide, it says the obligated parties, all fossil heat importers, Vermont Gas and delivered fuel importers. Do you know how many there are? Like, where are they? Because I think, at least for me, besides Vermont Gas, the only other fuel delivery mechanism I know is the company that brings a truck to my backyard. Like, are there 30? Are there?
We in the state of Vermont know how many there are. The tax department knows who they are. But the tax department doesn't share that information with us. I had a long conversation with the head of the Fuel Dealers Association about this. And I suspect the Fuel Dealers Association knows how many there are, but they weren't dealing. It's suffice it to say, there are a much smaller number of importers than there are fuel dealers delivering to your house or my house. Some of them are both. My provider is Irving. Irving's a big importer and a very big company. But if I had, one of the more so-called mom and pop fuel dealers, they're not importing huge quantities of fuel. They're buying it from a wholesale location. So there may be 180 members of the Fuel Dealers Association. I don't know the exact numbers, probably in that range. Maybe, and they're probably, 20 importers. I confess that I confess it's a guess because we haven't been told.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony today. Couple of questions. Nationally, if we were more energy independent, has there been any research done on how fossil fuels might be like pricing up or down? I mean, is that also a market issue?
When you say fossil fuels, the national market,
Yeah, if we were more energy and more, energy independent.
it really cuts both ways at the national level. If we were energy independent to the extent that we didn't export so much, the United States exports a lot of natural gas and oil. If we didn't export so much, then prices in the US would probably go down. But we're not really energy independent. We're a part of a global oil market, which is why the war in Ukraine has driven up the world price, and it showed up in my fuel bill.
If has there been any research done as if Vermont meets its goals under the Global Warming Solutions Act and in this bill if it were to pass, what impact will that have? Will Vermont's part be on a global scale?
Obviously, Vermont is a small part of the global problem. When the Paris Climate Accord was adopted, something like 196 countries that all pledged together to reduce their emissions. And that includes the United States. And everybody recognizes that every individual, the United States globally, historically, is the biggest polluter, although China now emits more per year than we do. We've got about 100-year head start on them. So cumulatively, we're still number one. The answer is a matter of political cooperation, frankly. We agree to do our part, and the Global Warming Solutions Act says we will do our part.
Okay.
And that's it. Now, the next question is, if Vermont acts, does that influence others to act? And therefore, is our impact greater? And I believe that when Vermont acts, actually, it makes a difference in the world. I have personal experience with that. I was advising the European Parliament on energy efficiency a few years ago, and I laid out for them the example of Efficiency Vermont, what we were doing in Vermont, by obliging electric companies and gas companies to reduce emissions. They were influenced by that and adopted an energy efficiency law for the European Union, where now 16 European countries have obligations on energy efficiency similar to ours. And I don't want to over exaggerate that, but the idea that Vermont has that Vermont is so small that it doesn't matter what we do, I don't think that's morally correct. it's not correct in thinking about the problem of global warming. And it's not actually accurate historically.
That wasn't where I was going. I was going to what impact would it have? I mean, you just explained it.
Yeah, we recognize that we're a small state. We're just doing our part.
I know, I hear you. And we know, like, we don't know where the fossil fuel, we were talking about this before, where the fossil fuel prices will be, and no one can guarantee that going down the road. We've asked, said you've asked the fuel dealers, and nobody can really give you an answer. But wouldn't that be the same with electric prices too? I mean, we really don't know where those are going. Or I mean, I know they're regulated, but.
Two things about that. First of all, they're regulated. Secondly, they're more significantly more stable because the resources that we get our power from are long-term resources for which the price trends are pretty well known. And so if you look at the charts that you've seen, the price, the cost of running a heat pump, in Vermont, it's a pretty much of a flat line. And it's, will it change as time goes by? Sure. But is it going to be lower and more stable than the price of oil? I believe it will be.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on nuclear power as far as clean energy goes?
Well, I should emphasize that my personal opinion is not really very important, but I'm of the opinion that if we have nuclear plants running today, that we should keep them running, because the running costs of nuclear are, barring accidents, the running costs of nuclear are pretty well known and they're pretty low.
You feel that would solve a lot of our concerns? I mean, France has, I believe, 5 nuclear power plants.
Yeah, they have more than 5. They're predominantly a nuclear power system.
Do you feel that our situation here with global warming, we would be doing our part by going nuclear?
No, because I want to emphasize, it's a really good question. I appreciate the question. The problem with nuclear isn't the running cost. The problem with nuclear is the cost of building them. The only nuclear plant that's close to relatively new in America today is being built in Georgia. And that plant has had billions and billions of dollars of price overruns and many years delay in getting it going. And I would not recommend that anybody try and do that, particularly since the cost of wind power and solar power has been dropping so much that it's cheaper now to build a new wind farm than it is to even operate a coal plant, and much less build a nuclear plant. So it's a really good question, but until someone invents a brand new modular, low cost, easy to site nuclear plant, I just don't think that's in our future.
Thank you.
So I keep going? All right. I like questions too much.
And we like asking them.
One thing so this picture, it doesn't answer a question, actually. It asks the question and then it only gives you one possible answer. But I just included in the slide deck because I want to make the point that we're going to meet the clean heat obligations and reduce our fossil emissions by a combination of things. There's going to be weatherization, heat pump hot water, air or ground source heat pumps, pellet stoves, a number of other things that can be done to improve our heating situation. And what what this chart shows, however, is that in order to meet the obligations of the GWSA, we're going to have to go a lot faster. And we're going right now. United Nations released a report on Monday. We're going to have a problem if my computer just died. Yes, it did. How can that be?
Presentation.
Oh,
We can run that, we can run it from our end and we all have it here. So you can keep
Yeah.
talking and Kate will put the slides. So if you stop sharing or I don't know, somehow Kate,
all right, let me
you
see.
can kick.
I don't know why it just decided it was tired.
We might all share the same things.
The United Nations report this, boiled down this week said, we need to be sprinting to meet global requirements, and we're only walking. And I would say, frankly, with respect to clean heat and buildings in Vermont, we're not really walking very fast. We're kind of ambling, I think. And this.
We have the slides now going behind you on.
Oh, okay, she's got them. All right, thank you very much. I'll just let that be if you've got them.
Tell her when you'd like the switch. If you want to be on 12 or 13,
Okay.
let us know. You want, how many switches do we need?
How many switches do we need? Okay. The only point here is that because it will be a market. I have these things. Oh, thank you. Because it will be a market and because customers will choose what they want. There's no point in predicting exactly what's going to happen, but we know that some combination of all those major things will need to happen. Happy to talk about any of them, but let's go to the next slide. The Global Warming Solutions Act requires, and also just as a matter of fundamental equity in Vermont, because we care about equity and we care about our neighbors, it's important that the clean heat transition be a just transition. And so the clean heat standard, the legislation you have in front of you calls out specifically a requirement that a more than proportional fraction of clean heat services be delivered to low and moderate income households. So that, there's a fear that if you just sort of let things happen, that lower income households and folks with higher energy burdens would be at the end of the line. And this legislation goes out of its way to say we're not going to do that. From the beginning, a proportional, slightly better than proportional fraction of clean heat measures have to be coming from low and moderate income households. And in addition, a substantial fraction of those savings have to be in the form of what are called installed measures, like weatherization or heat pumps or pellet stoves, things that are going to deliver lower bills for those households year after year, not just tomorrow or not just next year. It also creates an equity advisory committee to advise equity advisory group to advise the PUC and the other implementers of this legislation so that the voices of rural Vermonters, low-income Vermonters are heard in the process. Next slide. Cleaner heat and lower heat bills. All right.
You can watch them YouTube.
I think it's important to emphasize the degree to which the legislation you have in front of you is intended to deliver savings to Vermont heating customers over time. And, and sometimes people will, concentrate on just one aspect of this question and say, well, hold it. If there's an obligation on the importers, won't that drive up the price of delivered fuel to people still buying from those folks? And to the degree that clean heat credits are expensive, then that could show up in fuel bills. And I'm going to give you a few reasons why I think the legislation, that you should feel confident in passing this legislation, even though no one can tell you exactly what a clean heat credit is going to cost. And first of all, it's designed to be flexible, as I mentioned a while ago, that because we're not fixating on one technology, think about how much what we do today with Efficiency Vermont. Efficiency Vermont and the utilities offer rebates to customers to install a pellet stove, to install a heat pump, to do a weatherization job, that kind of thing. Those rebates are the program costs, and they're a relatively small fraction of the total cost of doing something. The people whose bills are going to go down are willing to pay the large majority of the cost of doing it. So you don't have to think about the clean heat program as, buying a heat pump for every homeowner in Vermont or a pellet stove. Making it flexible is a key feature of the legislation. It's also gradual. The amount of change that has to happen is roughly 4% per year. We're not trying to go out and renovate the entire housing stock tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Third, consider what we're comparing to. The comparison is to stay chained to the fossil fuel roller coaster. So what things cost has to be evaluated compared with the heat bill you're no longer paying. As we've already seen, many clean heat options already cost less than fossil. So switching to something that costs less is a savings for households that do it. We've got item 4 on this list. The clean heat standard. Think about what just happened. Congress enacted the Inflation Reduction Act that provides tax credits and cash payments to people who invest in clean heat. The money is sitting there. How much, that is such a boost to getting these services delivered in households around the state. So our program cost is only whatever's needed in addition to the federal incentive to inspire a homeowner to take an action or a business to take an action. And by the way, the business credits in the IRA are very substantial, both in business and in homes. These funds are sitting there, and I personally think it would be a shame if we didn't enact legislation soon that enabled us to capture more of that those federal incentives. We have studied in a general way how much the clean heat obligation would save Vermonters over time if it were adopted. And the abatement study that was conducted for the Climate Council found that the measures installed by 2030 would save over their lifetimes $2 billion for Vermont households. And this is because we would be switching from higher priced fossil fuels to lower cost alternatives. And in addition, they didn't even, there's an additional factor for what's the economic value of the avoided climate pollution. And that was estimated to be about $3 billion in addition. Energy performance standards. Now, just sort of cast your mind back a little ways. I used to, when I was on the Public Utilities Commission, we thought long and hard about how much we should be investing in wind and solar. And I'm sorry to say that was long enough ago that wind and solar were really expensive back then. So we took baby steps, but so did other states. And over time, the existence of the performance standard has driven down uptake of wind and solar, and the cost of wind and solar, depending on what year you start with, the cost of wind and solar have dropped by, depending on what you count, 75% to 90%. In other words, if we had done the analysis ahead of time and said, oh, it's going to cost too much, we shouldn't have a renewable standard, we would be ignoring the benefits of markets that drive competition when you have a performance standard. And the good news in those sectors is that the cost, we've learned that the cost of wind and solar has come down because of competition, because of performance standards. And the same thing is true with something as mundane as lighting. When we first started, installing a single compact fluorescent light bulb, it was a fairly expensive item. And now LED lighting is commonplace. It lowers, lighting bills by 90%. These technologies can improve over time, and the programs to deliver them improve over time, and costs go down. So to think that we know now what a heat pump is going to cost when we're establishing a competitive market for heat pumps installations would be a mistake. We just have to be cautious about thinking that we know the answer to that. S5, as you know, requires that a potential study be done alongside the rulemaking that the PUC would be doing, and that potential study and the rules come back to the legislature and delivered to you all, I think January 2025, before the program would even go into effect. And so you have, if you need belts and suspenders on this, you're going to have belts and suspenders. I think you're going to have both. I would also note, by the way, as someone who's been working in this field for a long time, the clean heat standard is not standing alone by itself. Clean heat standard is set so that the overall amount of reduction, let's say it's 4 or 5% a year, overall amount of reduction gives credit to, takes account of the things we're already doing. We already have weatherization programs. We already have tier 3 of the renewable standard. We already have energy efficiency programs. We have the CAP agencies delivering low-income weatherization. We have now the federal revenue for tax credits for the IRA. All of these things count and earn credits. So the obligated parties, when they're looking out there to say, well, where can I get credits? They can do things themselves. They can blend biofuels into their fuel mix. They can help their customers buy pellet stoves, or they can buy credits from all of these other programs that are already doing things. So the idea that we're trying to climb, a steep cliff here is just not right. We're actually building a set of stairs that include all those other programs.
So I just need to do a time check with you.
Yeah.
You need to wrap up by 10. And we have a lot going on, and we also need a break. So
thank you.
Yeah.
I totally appreciate that.
all right.
And I will also, and finally, I'm going to add on this point. that we know from experience that when you have complementary programs like this, they can work synergistically and positively. The climate plan also recommended weatherization at scale as a program. It also recommended doing something called on-bill financing to help people to invest in better furnaces, better insulation, what have you. And those measures have been proven to lower the cost of delivering these services to households and businesses. And so for all of those reasons, I think you can be comfortable. You can feel really comfortable that this program is designed to be flexible, affordable, and besides which, you're going to have a chance to kick the tires completely when it comes back to you. I will be happy. I'll stop right there. And I'm happy to talk about other design features anytime.
That would be great. We'll probably have you back for the rest of your presentation if it becomes apparently appropriate. Representative Stebbins, did you have a?
I did, but it's a nitty gritty in terms of how the credits work. So I'll say that.
Okay, thanks. Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mine may be similar. You mentioned the importers would be the obligation part of this. Are they? How does S5 set up the intended credits? Is it going to be paid for by the importers or the companies delivering the services?
By the importers.
By the importers.
The importers are obliged to acquire credits and retire them. And they can acquire them in a bunch of different ways. They can deliver services themselves if they want to. Let's say they put a biobrand in their fuel tanks, or they work with their fuel dealers to work with customers to install heat pumps, or they hire an HVAC contractor to install heat pumps. They can do it themselves. The legislation is set up to say that they have that choice, but in the absence of making that choice, their obligation would be performed by something called the default delivery agent, which is, you should think of this as akin to Efficiency Vermont. Right now, electric utilities in Vermont are obliged to deliver energy efficiency services. And they can do it themselves, or if they don't, Efficiency Vermont does it for them, and they pay Efficiency Vermont for that service. And this legislation is set up to have a very similar structure for the obligated parties. So let's just say if Irving Oil doesn't want to do these programs, they can. Their obligation can be taken up by the default delivery agent appointed by the PUC and regulated by the PUC. And that DDA, we call it, the DDA would be like Efficiency Vermont delivering the services and enlisting customers to participate in different programs, helping them install heat pumps, et cetera.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question. So the bill recognizes that Vermonters will have a choice, and their choice can be to do nothing and continue burning fossil fuels. So in order to achieve our goal, we're not asking everybody to participate. So my question is, based on the importers and the obligations they have with the delivery companies, I have heard, and I don't know the actual facts, but I've heard that 80% of our fuel dealers install alternative heating sources and 20% are just fuel delivery only. And like I say, I'm not sure about the numbers.
Okay.
So we're anticipating or expecting that those 80% will achieve our goal that is outlined in the Global Warming Solutions Act and our Climate Action Plan. I am concerned about penalizing the fuel delivery companies only that don't do the alternative installations. So if 100% of Vermonters aren't required to participate, I'm concerned about some mechanism of penalty or fuel delivery cost to those companies that don't install the alternatives. And I didn't know if you could speak to that.
Well, I'll state it a little differently. Everybody, to the degree that credits cost something, the obligated parties will bear that cost. And let's assume that they, sometimes these costs don't all get passed through, but let's just assume that the costs are passed through. They would be passed through not as a penalty to anybody, but it would just be as an increase in the price of fossil fuel, generally, at the wholesale level. So I view that as an obligation that is borne by the fossil fuel sector generally. And it's exactly similar to the way we pay for renewables and the way we pay for energy efficiency. The difference is that this would be the first time that we've actually said that we think the fossil industry also has an obligation to take steps towards addressing global warming. So right now, the cost of renewables and efficiency is being paid for by electric companies and their ratepayers. And it's roughly, depending on what you count, it's 7% at least of the cost of service of an electric company. That cost is being paid for by the clean fuels. The dirtier fuels aren't paying it. So that's the mismatch that we have in the energy sector right now. For years, we've been imposing the costs of addressing climate change. We've been imposing those costs on the cleaner fuels, and the more polluting fuels have not paid an equivalent cost. And this performance standard would, to some degree, require the fossil fuel industry to step up as part of the energy economy and contribute their part.
Okay, with that, we thank you very much for your testimony.
It's a pleasure.
And we will take a break till 10 past 10.